Pastor in Alabama found $10 million from a biker gang behind the church altar. St. Matthew's Baptist Church stood at the corner of Oak and Fifth, a modest white building with a crooked steeple that had weathered countless storms. Daniel had led the congregation there for 15 years, watching families come and go, baptizing babies who grew into teenagers, and burying the elderly who had built this town with their bare hands. On a humid Tuesday morning in late August, Daniel arrived at the church earlier than usual. The air conditioning unit had been making strange noises for weeks, and he wanted to check on it before the midweek service that evening. The temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees, and he could feel sweat forming on his brow as he unlocked the heavy oak doors. Inside, the church smelled of old wood and candle wax, familiar and comforting. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty space, and headed toward the altar. If you're watching this, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The altar had been damaged during last week's storm when a leak in the roof sent water cascading down onto the platform. Daniel had already patched the roof, but now he needed to assess the damage to the altar itself. As he knelt down and pulled away the purple cloth that draped over it, he noticed something odd. The back panel, which should have been flush against the wall, had shifted slightly. He ran his fingers along the edge and felt a gap. Curious, he applied gentle pressure, and the panel swung inward like a hidden door. Behind it was a cavity in the wall, and inside that cavity were stacks upon stacks of bundled cash. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the money. His hands trembled as he reached in and pulled out one of the bundles. $100 bills tightly wrapped in plastic. He counted quickly, $10,000 in his hand, and there were dozens more bundles just like it. He sat back on his heels, his mind racing. How long had this been here? Who put it there? His first instinct was to call the police, but something made him hesitate. He thought about the renovation work that had been done on the church 5 years ago, when they had replaced the floor and reinforced the foundation. The construction crew had been hired by Marcus Webb, a local businessman who owned several properties in town. Marcus had insisted on using his own crew, men he trusted, he had said. Daniel remembered those men. They were rough around the edges, covered in tattoos, riding motorcycles to work each day. At the time, he had been grateful for the discounted labor. The church couldn't afford much, and Marcus had been generous. But now, looking at this fortune hidden in his altar, Daniel wondered what kind of generosity it really was. He carefully replaced the panel and stood up, his legs unsteady. He needed to think. He walked to his office at the back of the church and locked the door behind him. His hands were still shaking as he poured himself a glass of water from the small cooler in the corner. $10 million, maybe more, hidden in his church. Behind the altar, where he stood every Sunday to preach about honesty and righteousness. The irony wasn't lost on him. Daniel spent the rest of the day in a fog, unable to focus on anything else. He cancelled his afternoon appointments and sat in his office staring at the phone. He should call Sheriff Morrison. That was the right thing to do. But something gnawed at him. If this money belonged to criminals and the police got involved, what would happen to his church? Would they shut it down as part of an investigation? Would his congregation, already struggling, be torn apart by scandal? That evening, as he locked up the church, he noticed a black motorcycle parked across the street. The rider sat astride it, helmet on, watching. Daniel's blood ran cold. He walked to his car, trying to appear calm, and drove home through the quiet streets of Mooresville. In his rearview mirror, he saw the motorcycle follow him for several blocks before turning off down a side street. At home, Daniel couldn't eat. His wife, Sarah, noticed immediately. They had been married for 23 years, and she could read him like a book. "What's wrong?" she asked as they sat at the dinner table. Their 2 children were away at college, and the house felt too big and too quiet. "Just a long day," Daniel said, pushing food around his plate. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "Daniel, I know you. Something's bothering you. Is it the church?" He wanted to tell her. He wanted to share this burden. But he also wanted to protect her. If this money was connected to dangerous people, the less she knew, the safer she would be. "Just financial worries," he said finally. "We're behind on the electric bill again." It wasn't entirely a lie. The church was always struggling financially. But it felt wrong to deceive Sarah, even with a partial truth. That night, Daniel barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through scenarios. By morning, he had made a decision. He would do some investigating on his own before involving the authorities. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. The next day, Daniel drove to the county clerk's office and requested the building permits for the church renovation from 5 years ago. The clerk, an elderly woman named Betsy who had known him for years, chatted pleasantly as she retrieved the files. "How's the church doing, Pastor?" she asked. "Hanging in there," Daniel replied. "We're survivors." He took the files to a table in the corner and began reading through them. The contractor listed was Webb Construction, owned by Marcus Webb. But as Daniel dug deeper, he found something interesting. The actual workers who had done the job were subcontracted through a company called Iron Brotherhood Services. A quick search on his phone revealed that Iron Brotherhood was linked to the Devil's Disciples, one of the most notorious biker gangs in the southeast. Daniel's stomach turned. He had suspected as much, but seeing it confirmed made it real. The Devil's Disciples were known for drug trafficking, weapons smuggling and violence. They had chapters across Alabama, Georgia and Mississippi. And somehow they had used his church to hide their money. Over the next few days, Daniel became obsessed with learning everything he could about the Devil's Disciples. He spent hours online, reading news articles and court documents. He learned that the gang had been under federal investigation for years, but law enforcement had struggled to build cases against the leadership. Members were loyal to a fault, and witnesses had a habit of disappearing. He also learned that Marcus Webb, the businessman who had helped fund the church renovation, had a brother named Tommy Webb, who was a high-ranking member of the Devil's Disciples. The pieces were falling into place. On Saturday afternoon, as Daniel was leaving the library after another research session, he found Marcus Webb waiting by his car. Marcus was in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Pastor Hayes," Marcus said warmly, "good to see you. Got a minute?" Daniel's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to smile. "Of course, Marcus. What can I do for you?" "Just wanted to check in on the church, make sure everything's holding up all right from that renovation we did a few years back." "Everything's fine," Daniel said carefully. "Why do you ask?" Marcus shrugged. "No reason. Just like to make sure my investments are sound, you know? That church means a lot to this community. Be a shame if anything happened to it." The words sounded friendly, but there was an edge to them, a warning. "We appreciate everything you did for us," Daniel said. Marcus nodded slowly. "I know you do, Pastor. You're a good man, honest. The kind of man who knows when to mind his own business and when to ask for help." He paused. "You need anything, you just call me, all right?" "I will," Daniel said. Marcus patted him on the shoulder and walked away, climbing into a black SUV parked nearby. As he drove off, Daniel noticed the motorcycle rider from before was parked down the street, watching. That night, Daniel told Sarah everything. They sat in their living room, and he explained about the money, the biker gang, the veiled threat from Marcus Webb. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each revelation. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We have to go to the police. If we do that, we might lose the church. The investigation could drag on for months, years. The congregation might not survive it. If we don't, we're accomplices," Sarah said firmly. "Daniel, you're a pastor. You know what's right." She was correct, and he knew it. But he also knew that doing the right thing might destroy everything he had built in Mooresville. The church was more than a building. It was the heart of the community. It was the food bank that fed 30 families every week. It was the after-school program that kept kids off the streets. It was the support group for recovering addicts. If the church went down, all of that went with it. "Give me one more day," Daniel said. "Let me think about the best way to handle this." Sarah agreed reluctantly, and they went to bed, but neither of them slept. The following morning was Sunday, and Daniel had to preach. He stood in front of his congregation, looking out at the familiar faces, elderly Mrs. Patterson, who had been coming to this church for 60 years, the Rodriguez family, who had immigrated from Mexico and found community here, young Billy Thompson, who had just gotten out of rehab and was trying to turn his life around. These were his people. How could he protect them? His sermon that morning was about Daniel in the lion's den, about having faith when faced with impossible choices. As he spoke, he realized he was preaching to himself as much as to anyone else. After the service, as people filed out, shaking his hand and thanking him for his words, Daniel noticed a man he didn't recognize sitting in the back pew. The man was in his 40s, heavily tattooed, wearing a leather vest with the Devil's Disciples insignia. He didn't approach, just sat there, watching. Daniel's heart raced, but he maintained his composure. He finished greeting his congregation, and when he turned back, the biker was gone. That afternoon, Daniel made his decision. He called Sheriff Morrison and asked to meet privately. They arranged to meet at the sheriff's house that evening, away from prying eyes. Sheriff Tom Morrison was in his late 50s, a career lawman who had seen Mooresville through its worst times. He listened as Daniel explained the situation, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "You did the right thing coming to me," Morrison said when Daniel finished. "But I've got to be honest with you, Pastor. This is bigger than anything I can handle. If the Devil's Disciples are involved, we need to bring in the FBI." "What will happen to the church?" Daniel asked. "I can't promise anything," Morrison said, "but I'll do everything I can to minimize the impact. The feds will want to seize the money as evidence, and they'll investigate how it got there. Your church will likely be examined as part of the crime scene, but if you cooperate fully, I think we can keep the church itself out of trouble." Daniel nodded. It wasn't the reassurance he wanted, but it was realistic. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "If the Devil's Disciples know or suspect that you found the money, you and your family could be in danger. These aren't people who forgive and forget." "What should I do?" "For now, act normal. Don't let on that you've talked to me. I'll contact the FBI tonight. They'll want to move quickly once they know about this. In the meantime, I'll have a deputy keep an eye on your house and the church." Daniel left the sheriff's house feeling both relieved and terrified. He had set events in motion that he couldn't stop. All he could do now was trust that he had made the right choice. The next 2 days passed in agonizing slowness. Daniel went through the motions of his daily routine, visiting church members in the hospital, counseling a young couple preparing for marriage, leading a Bible study on Wednesday evening. All the while, he felt eyes on him. The motorcycle rider appeared and disappeared. Marcus Webb called twice, ostensibly to discuss a charity event, but Daniel sensed he was fishing for information. On Thursday morning, 2 FBI agents arrived at Daniel's home. They were professional and efficient, introducing themselves as Special Agents Martinez and Chen. They asked Daniel to walk them through everything again, taking detailed notes. "We've been investigating the Devil's Disciples for 3 years," Agent Martinez explained. "This money could be the break we need, but we have to handle this carefully. If they suspect we're onto them, they'll move the money and we'll lose our chance." "What do you need from me?" Daniel asked. "We need to set up surveillance at the church," Agent Chen said. "We believe they'll come back for the money soon. They probably placed it there temporarily, planning to move it to a more permanent location. Your discovery might have interrupted that timeline." "You want to use the church as bait," Daniel said. "In a sense, yes," Martinez admitted. "But we'll have agents nearby at all times. You and your wife will be safe." Daniel wanted to believe them, but he knew that promises of safety were worth little when dealing with violent criminals. The FBI moved quickly. They installed hidden cameras in the church and set up a command post in a vacant building across the street. Daniel was instructed to continue his normal activities and to act as if nothing was wrong. On Saturday night, Daniel was at home when his phone rang. It was Sheriff Morrison. "They're moving," Morrison said. 3 vehicles just pulled up to the church. FBI's in position. Stay inside and lock your doors." Daniel woke Sarah, and they huddled together in their bedroom, listening to the police scanner that Morrison had given them. They could hear the terse communications between agents, the sound of engines shouting, then silence. 20 minutes later, Morrison called back. "It's over. They got 7 of them, including Tommy Webb. They were loading the money into trucks when the FBI moved in." There was some resistance, but no shots fired. "Everyone's in custody." Daniel felt his legs give out, and he sat down hard on the bed. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, and they both cried, from relief, from exhaustion, from the weight of what they had been carrying. The next morning, the news was all over the local stations. Federal agents had arrested 7 members of the Devil's Disciples in Mooresville, seizing over $10 million in cash believed to be proceeds from drug trafficking. St. Matthew's Baptist Church was mentioned as the location of the seizure, but the news reports made it clear that the church had been an unwitting victim, used by criminals to hide their ill-gotten gains. Pastor Daniel Hayes was praised for his cooperation with law enforcement. Over the following weeks, more arrests were made. Marcus Webb was taken into custody and charged with conspiracy and money laundering. His brother Tommy and 5 other high-ranking members of the Devil's Disciples faced federal racketeering charges. The investigation widened, reaching into other states, dismantling a network that had operated for decades. For Daniel and Sarah, life slowly returned to normal, though it would never be quite the same. The church became briefly famous, with reporters and curious onlookers visiting to see where the money had been hidden. But the congregation rallied around their pastor, grateful for his honesty and courage. 3 months after the arrests, the FBI held a press conference announcing the indictments of 37 members of the Devil's Disciples across 4 states. Agent Martinez personally thanked Pastor Hayes for his role in breaking the case. Without his cooperation and bravery, this investigation might have taken years longer, Martinez said. Daniel watched the press conference from his living room, Sarah by his side. He didn't feel brave. He felt like someone who had simply tried to do the right thing and had been terrified every step of the way. The church itself survived the ordeal. Donations poured in from across the state, from people moved by the story of the small-town pastor who had stood up to a dangerous gang. For the first time in years, St. Matthew's was financially stable. They were able to expand their food bank, hire a youth minister, and finally replace that troublesome air conditioning unit. One Sunday morning, about 6 months after it all began, Daniel stood at the altar, the same altar where he had found the money, and looked out at his congregation. It had grown, new faces mixed with the old, people who had heard the story and wanted to be part of a church that stood for something. "I want to talk today about choices," Daniel began. about the moments in life when we have to decide between what's easy and what's right. 6 months ago, I faced such a choice. I was terrified. I worried about this church, about all of you, about my family. I worried that doing the right thing would destroy everything we had built together. He paused, looking at Sarah in the front pew, at Mrs. Patterson dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, at Billy Thompson sitting up straight and paying attention. But what I learned is that doing the right thing doesn't destroy what's good, it strengthens it. Yes, we went through a difficult time. Yes, we were afraid. But we came out the other side stronger, more united, more committed to our mission. Because a church isn't a building. It isn't even the people in it. It's the principles we stand for, the values we uphold, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The congregation responded with murmured amens and nodding heads. After the service, as Daniel stood outside shaking hands, a young man approached him. He was in his early 20s, clean-cut, nervous. "Pastor Hayes, my name is Jake Webb. Marcus Webb was my uncle." Daniel tensed, but didn't let it show. "Hello, Jake." "I just wanted to say thank you," Jake continued. "What you did, turning in my uncle and his friends, it was the right thing. I grew up around those guys, and I almost went down the same path. But seeing what happened, seeing you stand up to them, it made me realize I didn't have to follow in their footsteps. I'm in community college now, studying to be a teacher. I wanted you to know that your choice made a difference, at least for me." Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. He shook Jake's hand firmly. "Thank you for telling me that. It means more than you know." As Jake walked away, Daniel looked up at the church steeple, crooked as ever, pointing toward the sky. The journey had been terrifying, but it had been worth it. He had protected his church not by hiding the truth, but by exposing it. He had saved his community not through silence, but through courage. The autumn sun warmed his face, and for the first time in months, Daniel Hayes felt truly at peace. 1 year had passed since that Sunday morning when Daniel Hayes stood before his congregation and spoke about choices. The seasons had turned full circle, and autumn had returned to Mooresville, painting the handful of trees along Main Street in shades of gold and amber. St. Matthew's Baptist Church had changed in ways both visible and invisible, transformed by the events that had thrust it into the national spotlight. Daniel stood in his office, looking at the framed newspaper clipping on his wall. The headline read, "Small-town pastor helps FBI dismantle major drug network." He still felt uncomfortable with the attention, but Sarah had insisted on framing it, not as a monument to pride, she had said, but as a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood for what was right. The church had indeed flourished in the aftermath. The donations that poured in had allowed them to do more than just pay bills and fix the air conditioning. They had launched a community center that operated out of the church basement 5 days a week, offering everything from GED classes to job training programs. The food bank now served 50 families instead of 30. They had partnered with a drug rehabilitation center in Huntsville to provide support services for people in recovery. But success had brought its own complications. On this particular October morning, Daniel was preparing for a meeting he had been dreading for weeks. The church council had called a special session to discuss what they were calling the future direction of St. Matthew's. Daniel knew what that meant. Some members wanted to capitalize on their fame, to expand aggressively, to become a mega-church. Others wanted to return to the quiet, simple ministry they had known before. The meeting was scheduled for 7 that evening, and Daniel spent the day visiting church members, trying to gauge where people stood. His first stop was Mrs. Patterson's house, a small cottage on the edge of town. She was 87 now, and she had been a member of St. Matthew's longer than Daniel had been alive. "Come in, Pastor," she said. ushering him into her living room, which smelled of coffee and old books. "I suppose you're here about tonight's meeting." "I am," Daniel admitted, settling into the worn armchair she offered. "I'd like to know your thoughts." Mrs. Patterson poured him coffee from a porcelain pot that looked like an antique. "I've been thinking about this church for a long time, Pastor. I remember when it was just 20 families. I remember when we couldn't afford to heat the building in winter. And I remember when you first arrived, fresh out of seminary, so young and idealistic." She smiled at the memory. "This church has survived a lot. The Depression, wars, the closing of the mill, and now this business with the criminals. It survived because it stayed true to its purpose, serving this community, not serving itself. Some people think we have an opportunity to do more," Daniel said carefully. "Some people always think that," Mrs. Patterson replied. "But bigger isn't always better. Sometimes it's just bigger. You have to ask yourself, Pastor, what kind of church do we want to be? The kind that chases growth and numbers, or the kind that knows every person's name, every family's struggles?" Daniel nodded slowly. He had always known where Mrs. Patterson stood, but hearing her articulate it helped clarify his own thoughts. His next visit was to the Rodriguez family. Carlos and Maria Rodriguez had immigrated from Mexico 15 years ago, finding work at a manufacturing plant in Decatur. They had 3 children, all born in Alabama, all active in the church youth group. Carlos answered the door, his work clothes still dusty from his shift. "Pastor Hayes, come in, Carlos said warmly. The Rodriguez house was small but immaculate, filled with the smell of Maria's cooking. They sat at the kitchen table while Maria brought out coffee and pan dulce. Daniel explained the situation, and Carlos listened thoughtfully. "When we first came to Mooresville, we didn't know anyone," Carlos said. "We went to the big church in Huntsville for a few weeks, but it was too much. Too many people, too fast, too impersonal. Then we found St. Matthew's, and it was different. People knew our names. They helped us when Carlos Jr. was sick and we couldn't afford the medical bills. This church saved our family." Maria nodded emphatically. "We don't need to be big. We need to be family." But not everyone felt the same way. That afternoon, Daniel met with Kenneth Burke, a successful real estate developer who had joined the church 2 years ago. Kenneth was in his 40s, energetic and ambitious, and he saw the church's recent fame as a launching pad. "Pastor, with all due respect, I think we're being short-sighted," Kenneth said as they sat in his spacious office overlooking the Tennessee River. "We have resources now. We have name recognition. We could build a new facility, hire additional staff, start satellite campuses. We could reach thousands of people instead of hundreds." "And what would we lose?" Daniel asked. "Nothing," Kenneth insisted. "We'd just be adding to what we already have." "But would we still be the same church? Would we still know everyone's name? Would we still be able to give personal attention to people in crisis?" Kenneth leaned back in his leather chair. "You can't think small forever, Pastor. God doesn't want us to hide our light under a bushel." "No," Daniel agreed, "but he also doesn't want us to lose ourselves in the pursuit of growth." The meeting that evening was tense from the beginning. The church council consisted of 9 members, and they were evenly divided. Kenneth Burke presented his vision for expansion, complete with architectural drawings and financial projections. He spoke passionately about reaching more people, doing more good, making a bigger impact. Then Sarah Hayes stood up. Daniel hadn't expected his wife to speak, but she had asked to be included in the meeting. "I want to tell you all a story," Sarah began. 3 months ago, I got a call from a woman named Jennifer. She had just moved to Mooresville from Birmingham, running from an abusive husband. She had 2 kids, no job, and nowhere to go. She called St. Matthew's because someone told her we helped people. Sarah paused, looking around the room. "I met Jennifer at the church the next day. We sat in the sanctuary, just the two of us, and she told me her story. She cried, I cried, and then we figured out how to help her. We connected her with a domestic violence shelter, helped her find temporary housing, got her enrolled in our job training program. Today, Jennifer has a job at the library and an apartment of her own. Her kids are thriving. Sarah's voice grew stronger. Now, I want you to imagine if we had been a mega church with thousands of members. Would Jennifer have gotten through to me on the phone? Would I have had time to sit with her for 3 hours? Would we have been able to mobilize our community so quickly to help her? Or would she have been just another name on a list, another case to be processed? The room was silent. I'm not against growth, Sarah continued, but I am against growth that sacrifices what makes us special. We are not called to be the biggest church. We are called to be faithful. We are called to see people, really see them, and help them. That's what Daniel did when he found that money. He could have ignored it, could have looked the other way, but he saw the situation for what it was, and he did what was right, even though it was hard. That's who we are. That's who we should stay. When she sat down, Carlos Rodriguez started clapping. Then Maria joined him, and then Mrs. Patterson, and within seconds the entire room was applauding. Kenneth Burke shook his head. I think you're all making a mistake, but I respect the process. He stood up and walked out of the meeting. The council voted 7-2 to maintain the church's current size and focus, using their resources to deepen their ministry rather than expand it. It wasn't unanimous, and Daniel knew some people would leave over this decision, but it felt right. After the meeting, as people filed out, Billy Thompson approached Daniel. Billy was the young man who had been in rehab when the money was discovered. He was 2 years sober now, working as a mechanic and attending church regularly. Pastor, I just want to say something, Billy said. A year ago I was nobody, just another junkie from a nowhere town. But this church saw me as somebody worth saving. You personally visited me in rehab every week. You gave me a job helping with maintenance when I got out. You believed in me when nobody else did. Billy's eyes were wet. If this church had been some huge place with thousands of people, I would have fallen through the cracks. But you knew my name. You knew my story. You cared. That's why I'm still sober. That's why I'm still alive. So thank you for deciding to stay small, because small meant you could see me. Daniel embraced the young man, feeling the weight of the decision they had made. This was why they had done it, not for fame, not for growth, but for Billy and Jennifer and all the other people who needed a church that could actually see them. As Daniel locked up the church that night, he noticed a car parked across the street. For a moment his heart jumped. Memories of the motorcycle rider still haunted him sometimes, but then the car door opened and Jake Webb stepped out. Marcus Webb's nephew, the young man who had thanked Daniel after that sermon 6 months ago. Jake, Daniel called out, everything okay? Yeah, Pastor, Jake said, walking over. I was just driving by and saw the lights on. I wanted to tell you something. I got accepted to the University of Alabama. I'm transferring there next semester to finish my teaching degree. Jake, that's wonderful. I know it's late, but I was hoping you might pray with me, Jake said. I'm nervous about leaving Mooresville. This is where I finally figured out who I wanted to be. I'm worried about going back out into the world. They stood there on the church steps under the star-lit Alabama sky, and Daniel prayed for Jake Webb, the nephew of a criminal who had become a symbol of redemption. He prayed for strength and wisdom and courage. He prayed that Jake would remember where he came from and stay true to who he had become. After Jake drove away, Daniel walked home through the quiet streets of Mooresville. The town looked the same as it had 15 years ago when he first arrived, small, modest, a little worn around the edges, but it was home. And St. Matthew's was its heart, beating steadily, faithfully, serving one person at a time. When he reached his house, Sarah was waiting on the porch. "How do you feel about tonight?" she asked as he sat beside her. "Good," Daniel said. "Uncertain, but good. We'll lose some people. Kenneth will probably leave. Maybe others too. But we'll still be us," Sarah said. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "We'll still be us." They sat together in the darkness, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of the Tennessee River. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of faith. But tonight, Daniel Hayes felt at peace. They had found $10 million behind the altar, faced down a biker gang, helped the FBI dismantle a criminal organization, and emerged stronger for it. Not because they had gotten bigger or richer or more famous, but because they had stayed true to who they were. A small church in a small town, doing small things with great love. And sometimes, Daniel thought as he held his wife's hand, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.